He threw snow into our yard. He screamed at us for not cutting our grass just right. He even stared at my teenage sister while she mowed the lawn. He was in his 70s, and he made every day feel like a battle. But I found his weakness, and the way I used it against him. It's the kind of quiet revenge you'll never forget. If you've ever dreamed of giving someone a taste of their own medicine, hit that like button and subscribe. Because today's story isn't about fists or fights. It's about finding the crack in a bully's armor and pressing it until the whole thing shatters. I grew up in what should have been a peaceful neighborhood. Kids played outside. Families mowed lawns. Snow shovels scraped sidewalks in the winter. But for my family, peace was impossible because of the man living right next door. He was in his 70s, but age hadn't softened him. If anything, it sharpened his anger. He had a permanent skull etched into his face, and his voice carried across the street like a whip crack. Winters were the worst. Instead of piling his snow neatly on his side, he'd throw it directly into our yard. Big heaps of icy slush burying the driveway my dad had just cleared. Summers weren't better. He'd lean on his fence, watching, judging. If a single blade of our grass grew too high, he'd yell and swear about how we weren't keeping things nice. But what made my blood boil most was how he watched my younger sister. She wasn't even 18, yet whenever she went outside to mow, he'd stand there, eyes fixed, as if the yard work was his personal show. It made her uncomfortable. It made me furious. But he didn't care. He thrived on making us feel powerless. One winter afternoon, I learned just how dangerous he could be. My sister and I were outside shoveling snow when he exploded. He came charging across the yard, fists clenched, shouting about how we were ruining everything. For a second, I thought he was going to swing at me. My chest tightened, adrenaline spiked, and I clenched my own fists. My knuckles turned white round the shovel handle. I locked eyes with him and growled, "One more step, and I'll drop you." He stopped, barely. His whole body shook with rage, but he didn't move closer. My mom called the police, but when they came, nothing happened. No charges, no warnings, just a shrug, and that smirk on his face as the cops drove away. It told me everything. He thought he was untouchable. Living under the shadow wore us down. My sister avoided the yard. My parents looked exhausted, and me. I lay awake at night replaying his face, his shouts, that smug grin. That's when I remembered something. A rant he'd gone on once, red-faced and spitting, about how much he hated religion, especially door-to-door visits, Jehovah's Witnesses. The way he talked about them, you'd think they were his personal demons, and that's when it clicked. I couldn't beat him in a fight. The police wouldn't help, but I could make sure those demons came knocking out the first time. I made a simple phone call, gave his address, and up. Then I waited. A few days later, there was a knock at his door. I peeked through the curtain as two polite visitors smiled and greeted him. His face twisted instantly. He shouted. He waved his arms. He slammed the door, and I smiled. From then on, it became my secret weapon. Every time he screamed at us, every time he cursed or made my sister feel unsafe, I'd send another visit his way. Sometimes I called, sometimes I mailed. I kept it unpredictable, so he could never brace himself, and I always watched. Watched him fumble at the door, watched his lips curl as he barked at them to leave, watched the red creep up his neck. His fists clenching at his sides jarred. It was like watching a man trapped in his own personal nightmare. And the best part, he had no idea I was the one pulling the strings. Over time, the change was obvious. He grew more irritable, more paranoid. He'd pace his yard, muttering. He looked over his shoulder more often. The smug confidence he once wore like armor began to crack out to him. It must have felt like the universe itself was against him. Every outburst he made at us seemed to summon another unwanted knock at his door. And from me, for the first time in years, I felt powerful. Not violent, not reckless, just quietly, cleverly powerful. But life has a way of finishing what you start. Not long after, word spread. He'd been arrested for abusing his wife. It hit me like a cold wind. I wasn't shocked. Anyone living under his roof had to be suffering. But I felt something close to justice. The man who made our lives hell, who smirked when the police turned their backs, finally faced a cage he couldn't yell his way out of. And all the while, I kept my secret. It wasn't until years later that I told my parents. We were sitting round, talking about the old days, and I admitted it. Every time he lashed out, I 6 Jehovah's Witnesses on him. There was silence at first. Then my parents burst into laughter. The tension of years melted into pure relief. We hadn't beaten him with fists or threats, but I'd found his weakness and exploited it until he crumbled. The sweetest moment wasn't his arrest. It wasn't even the police reports. It was the image burned into my mind of him, red-faced and furious, forced to confront the one thing he despised over and over again. That's the beauty of quiet revenge. He thought he was in control, but every time that doorbell rang, I knew I was the one really pulling the strings. Sometimes justice isn't about shouting the loudest or throwing the hardest punch. Sometimes it's about patience, about finding the one crack in someone's armor and pressing it until it breaks. If the story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell me in the comments, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever seen? And of course, subscribe for more stories like this, because sometimes the best justice comes quietly.